You're listening to a 58 Ember production.
Deleted scenes are some of fans' favorite bonus features. Today, we're looking at the deleted scenes from Revenge of the Sith and examining how and why they ended up on the cutting room floor.
Welcome to Sky Talkers. Here are your hosts, Charlotte and Caitlin.
Hello, and welcome to Sky Talkers. I'm your host, Charlotte.
And I'm your host, Caitlin, and welcome to this week's episode where we are tackling the deleted scenes of Revenge of the Sith. I wish you could see our Google Doc right now. For some reason, it's 21 pages.
You'd think it would be a simple episode, right? You would think that. But no, this has turned into a really intense research project that I was not expecting at all.
Yeah, I don't know if it's just because we've kind of been in TV mode a lot recently that it feels like it's been a minute since we've kind of dived into something that's a little bit more research heavy, because we've had Skeleton Crew, we've been doing the Clone Wars and stuff like that, which does not require the same kind of research that something like this does. Guys, I popped open my DVD from 2005, had to put batteries in the remote for the DVD player.
Are you serious?
To go back and watch at least some of the deleted scenes that were on the DVD and listen to the intros from George and Rick and stuff like that. But it was very fun. We do have a lot of notes. It feels a little overwhelming, honestly, but I think it's going to be a good discussion. And I know there's definitely some of these deleted scenes that we'll be spending a lot of time on, more so than others.
Yeah, spoiler alert. There's a lot of deleted scenes for Revenge of the Sith, ones that I didn't even know you would count as deleted scenes. And we don't want to leave any stone unturned. So we're going to be talking about at least the released ones, and maybe a bonus one too. But one thing that needs to be noted up top is we're going to be talking about scenes that not all of them are on Disney Plus. So there's a whole section, and I've talked about this before on the show, that there's a whole section of 3 deleted scenes with Padmé in him, with Bail and Mon Mothma. 2 of them are on Disney Plus, but the final one, which is the most cutting, is not. And you'll need to go to YouTube or pop open your DVD or Blu-ray to watch that one, because it's weird that they left that out, because to be honest, I feel like that is the most pivotal one.
It's weird. It's very weird.
It's so weird. Yeah. So it's super weird. And but we're going to talk about everything. And like we said, we did do a fair amount of research for this. It required us to take out a lot of our making of books and kind of create a timeline. I wouldn't say that any of our research is perfect by any means, and I feel like we have twisted ourselves into a pretzel around
the timeline,
the timing of like when things were shot versus when things were cut. And it's really, I think it's just a little difficult when we talk about George Lucas and editing in real time and cutting, and just the fact that when you read these making of books, my experience of reading J.W. Rinsler's amazing, perfect making of Revenge of the Sith, it's super detailed, but you really get a sense that George, this is how he works. He just, they have the concepting phase, and there's no script. There's no draft for months. And it takes a while for the things to be ironed out. We've talked about this on the show before with different takes on the dark side that were explored with Revenge of the Sith in an episode entitled The Dark Side. If you want to listen to that, we also have a follow-up episode with that one as well. And so we talk through the process of Revenge of the Sith and creating Revenge of the Sith there as well. But I think when we dive into okay, when was this scene concepted and when was it shot versus when was it cut? And it gets a little confusing.
Kind of an impossible timeline to make.
Yeah. And yeah, so we're trying, and just bear with us. And I guess in this episode, we're just going to be talking about each individual scene. And I think that Revenge of the Sith has some excellent deleted scenes, and we have a lot of great quotes that we're going to talk about too. So
yeah,
where should we start?
Well, I want to say, when we were rewatching Revenge of the Sith too, I just need to share that I sent myself into an emotional tailspin here at the top of the show. So I finished watching Revenge of the Sith. I was pretty sad because, it's a sad movie. And then I texted Charlotte. I said, I must hate myself because I decided as the credits rolled to go put on Tales of the Jedi when Ahsoka goes to Padmé's funeral. And then I decided to up the ante and go to the last episode of Obi-Wan Kenobi and fast forward to when Obi-Wan is telling little Princess Leia about all the great qualities of her parents that she has. And anyway, I just needed to share that with all of you. It's not for the faint of heart. And it was very emotional, but I will say they flowed very nicely. And like I said, I just wanted to share that because I don't really think there'll be a good spot to share that in our discussion as we're going through. But that was part of my rewatch experience. And if you too are in need of a good cry, that is one recipe to get yourself there.
I feel like there's a couple of pairings that you could do with Revenge of the Sith in terms of a watch experience. You could do Revenge of the Sith Rogue One. You could do Revenge of the Sith and Tales of the Jedi. You could do Revenge of the Sith and Season Mandalore. We've done that before.
Yeah.
And I've done the Rogue One before as well. And I think it's cool that we have these pairings, but it's also devastating. And I have to be honest, every time I watch Star Wars, I swear, every single time I watch a movie, we talk about this all the time, but I come away with it with like renewed sense of damn perfect movie type vibes.
Yeah.
and also just different things stick out. And God, is it insane to watch the prequels these days. It is just wild.
It sure is.
George really got it, and it is so crazy.
He was saying some things, but
yeah.
I also have to say that it was a really nice flow from Revenge of the Sith to Tales of the Jedi and then into Obi-Wan Kenobi because, you know, Bail and Obi-Wan are so present at the end of Revenge of the Sith. And then in Ahsoka or in Tales of the Jedi, Bail is telling Ahsoka, you know, if you ever need help, you can call me. And Ahsoka is talking about how she feels so defeated, basically. And Bail is like, I'll be there for you. And then you fast forward however many years later at the end of Obi-Wan Kenobi, and Bail is telling Obi-Wan how defeated he feels and how scared he feels for the future. And Obi-Wan says, you can call me whenever you need me. And I was like, this just... fractals, it's poetry, it rhymes, and
so
yeah,
good.
perfect movie vibes and emotional and good, very good.
Yeah, I'm just like really struck by the fact that it's been 20 years since Revenge of the Sith 2, and just like reflecting on this Star Wars journey from when that movie came out to where we are as fans now, and just how pivotal this movie is in that fan experience and journey. And I think that's something that we're going to be talking about throughout the entire year, honestly. But I'm really in a Revenge of the Sith era.
Yeah. And also, before we really get started, Charlotte is on the lookout for some good Annie Dalla fan fiction. So
yes, please recommend, because I
send some to her.
It's really hard to find good ones these days. I have to be honest. I don't know what's going on.
She's not setting the filters right. Something's not clicking. So if you have good recommendations, please send them.
Email them.
Yeah, please send them our way. But this is going to be a 3-part episode. We have kind of broken up the deleted scenes by theme, setting, that kind of vibe. So part 1 is going to be cut scenes from the Invisible Hand and also cut scenes involving the Jedi and the Jedi Council.
Part 2 will be the Seeds of Rebellion cut plot.
And then part 3 will be going over some of the animatics.
So without further ado, let's get started.
So who talks first? You talk first? I talk first.
All right, welcome to part 1, where we're talking all about cut scenes from The Invisible Hand, the beginning of the film, and also some scenes with the Jedi and Jedi Council. Before we started, I wanted to, just put this quote at the beginning of our discussion, mainly because I didn't know another good place to put it, but it's George Lucas in the making of J.W. Rensler's book, Making of Revenge of the Sith, talking about basically his editing process and what happens when you start cutting scenes out and putting other scenes next to each other, et cetera, et cetera. And I thought it might be a good kind of framing device as we go into this conversation to be thinking about how George thinks about cutting scenes and editing his movie. So this quote is from March 9th, 2004. So well after kind of all of the initial shooting has been done for Revenge of the Sith. They will still do pickup shots later in the year, but the bulk of filming, the vast majority of filming has been completed. And he's talking about editing the film and how they're cutting things out. Quote, right now, it's an everything must go sale, George says. And he adds on to what is now being referred to as more of a rough assembly of the film. And he's now 2 to 3 weeks into the reorganizing of the film. He goes on to say, the first script I wrote had stories for everybody, and I cut it down and we had a script, but when we cut it together, there were still problems. Finally, I said, okay, let's be even more hard-nosed here and take out every scene that doesn't have anything to do with Anakin. And that causes you to juxtapose certain scenes that you were never contemplating juxtaposing before. And these scenes have different qualities than before because these scenes were never meant to be next to each other. In one case, there was supposed to be a scene with Padmé and Bail Organa in between 2 Anakin scenes because we were following her story along with his. And when most of those scenes were cut suddenly, all sorts of weird things started to happen that weren't intended in the script. But in some cases, it actually worked much better. What happens then is that some of the themes grab hold of each other and really strengthen themselves in ways that are fascinating. You pull things together and suddenly a theme is drawn out because it's in 3 consecutive scenes instead of just one. Suddenly, one theme is infinitely stronger than it was before. So we'll strengthen that theme because it seems poetic. End quote. Does anything stick out to you about that or you want to comment on?
Well, I think I'm going to spoil what I wanted to talk about at the end, and we'll talk about this more in detail then, but about there's a scene that no one has seen. It's not officially released or anything. Maybe we'll get that this year, who knows, between Obi-Wan and Padmé, where Obi-Wan sort of reveals to Padmé that he knows about Anakin's love for Padmé. And so then there would be this scene of Obi-Wan talking with Padmé, and then the scene later in which Obi-Wan confronts Padmé around finding out where Anakin is. And then that ends with Obi-Wan saying, Anakin's the father, isn't he? I'm so sorry. So instead of having these 2 scenes of Obi-Wan saying that he knows about Anakin and Padmé, we only have one, and that one is way more devastating and way more dramatic. And by cutting that first one, even though it's truly devastating for fans of Padmé, like myself, like I see this and I'm like, that is perfect. It's in the novelization. I think it's a great scene in the novelization. I think dramatically, when we are talking about a 2-hour and 2-minute movie or whatever, that just leaving the one in makes way more sense. And I think that can be said for several, because we're talking about the themes, right? The themes that emerge when you take things out. And what emerges is that there's a concealment of communication, right? Something we've talked about heavily on this show. And all of these things are working against Anakin, making his fall more tragic. So when you take out these external subplots and focus it way more on Anakin, that's so true. Like George is right. It focuses way more on the tragedy. It focuses way more on the themes. What are your thoughts on it?
Yeah, I agree with you. And I think one thing that we'll see and be talking about as we go through is that George's editing process and deciding what to cut out, a lot of it was focusing more in on Anakin as much as possible. And I think the big plot that suffers from this or gets left on the cutting room floor is obviously the Padmé plot, which we'll be talking a lot about. But that for George's goals for the film, that became really necessary. And you had to kind of focus everything in on Anakin and what he was being told in the moment, how he was reacting to it, and how it was changing his perception of the people around him, upping his paranoia in a lot of places, and ultimately what action he was going to take because of it.
Yeah, fully. Let's talk about the invisible hand scenes and like really get into it. So there's a couple here. There's the elevator antics scene. There's escape through the hangar and Grievous slaughtering a Jedi / escape from the general. And all these are really fun.
They are. I think so. In elevator antics, this is kind of when we have a lot more of the development of kind of the comedic side of Anakin and Obi-Wan's relationship, also within Escape Through the Hangar. And they have some more of these funny moments that they're doing. We get Anakin, who was it Anakin saying Roger, Roger? And
they both said Roger, Roger. Anakin goes Roger, and then Obi-Wan finishes his sentence with Roger. It is so funny to me. There's a lot of finishing each other's sentences.
It's very funny. And we have Anakin speaking droid, and they have R2's beeps put in. It's very funny. And I have always wondered why this didn't come up somewhere in the Clone Wars. And maybe it has and I've forgotten it, but we are in our Clone Wars
Put a pin in
rewatch,
it.
yeah. But I don't think it has, and it seems
Me
like
neither.
something perfect. It having the arts Anakin speak the R2D2 beeps really kind of takes you out of it, I think. So I feel like that was ultimately the right move to take it out of Revenge of the Sith, but it, man, would have been perfect in the Clone Wars.
Yeah, in the making of book, Rinsler writes that that whole scene with the elevator was the literal first thing that they shot in principal photography in June 2003, by the way. And they had a million takes with George Lucas constantly being like, quote, I think we can go a little lighter. I think we can go a little lighter. Let's go a little lighter. And we get to the point where I feel like I'm watching Hayden Christensen and Ewan McGregor, not necessarily Anakin Skywalker and Obi-Wan Kenobi. And it's really fun. And I think you're so right. It is very Clone Wars to me, but I understand the purpose of this because we're really in the beginning here, we're telling the story before we had the Clone Wars TV series, even fully disregarding the micro series too. This whole beginning is telling the story of the Clone Wars and how close Anakin and Obi-Wan had gotten to the point of brotherhood versus the last movie. They got to the point of father-son, right? And so the silly stuff like fully makes sense. And I think it's really fun. It's just, it's kind of silly.
It's very silly. And I think it makes sense for them wanting to focus as much as they could on their relationship, considering where we end the movie with Obi-Wan and Anakin, and obviously the duel on Mustafar. You were my brother. I loved you. So to kind of book at or have this be the beginning of really lighthearted, they're having so much fun. Look how cute they are together. They finish each other's sentences to, a fight to the death, basically, at the end. It really ups the emotional stakes. But I think ultimately it was the right move. And the initial cut of The Invisible Hand, like we said, was so long and they really had to get it cut down. The original cut was like an hour long.
Over an hour.
Yeah, and so it's like 20, 25 minutes now. It's already pretty long, honestly. So there was a lot that had to be cut. And George kind of talks about this in the Escape Through the Hangar in the making of book when they're talking about shooting these scenes. He has a quote about really kind of setting up and editing down the first half of the movie. So this quote is from August 22nd, 2003. And George says, "You have to make sure that you're being diligent about telling the story of the movie, because once the film gets on screen, it's really unforgiving. Any little tangent can become boring. If you screw up 5 minutes, it affects the next 10 to 15 minutes. If your first half hour isn't that great, your last half hour better be really spectacular. If it isn't, then you're building up a lot of bad will. Over the last 30 years, the sophistication of the audience's cinema knowledge and cinema psychology has really grown. Back when I was shortcutting, it was unusual. I shortcut by not holding long shots, not doing establishing shots, and by making large leaps forward in the editing. When I was doing the first Star Wars, I was reasonably avant-garde. Now it's completely accepted because people's skill at reading images and emotion is much better. Younger audiences can pretty much follow everything because they see a commercial, they see MTV videos, they do it in video games. Their ability to see things and follow them is much more acute, and that's just a matter of the culture learning." This is a fascinating quote, and I would love to know his take on it
Now, in the
because
short-term attention span.
I feel like such an old person being like, the kids these days, their media literacy is gone. But sometimes it really does feel like that. And I don't want to paint people with a broad brushstroke, of course, but sometimes it does feel like media literacy is less now. And I do think that has a lot to do with, social media, shorter attention spans, like short video is what's in right now and stuff like this. But I think at the time in the 2000s, I think George was right that people's media literacy was growing, especially I think people in our generation and obviously older and younger, but that were really kind of taking technology and new ways of telling stories in stride and really kind of growing with the technology that was being introduced at the time, which was all really new. But him talking in the first half of the quote about the beginning of your film and how it's really important. And, if the first half hour sucks, you got to make sure the last half hour is really good. And I think it was a lot of it was clearly a lot of cutting down for what was happening in the first half on the invisible hand. And I mean, I think the whole invisible hand sequence is so great. It looks incredible. I think it's very fast paced. It's one of my favorite parts. I think it's just so fun.
I agree with you. I just want to comment a little bit on the media literacy thing because I fully agree that it does feel like people's media literacy is going way down because of potentially short form video. But I do feel like there's a piece of it that it's not the whole piece. It's not even 50% of the piece. But I do feel like filmmakers these days, and this is a general statement, are less likely to trust their audience than they ever were before, potentially because of what we're talking about with media literacy being at an all-time low. And I think it's because of that we're feeding into the media literacy being at an all-time low, if that makes sense. Like we're not trusting our audiences.
Yeah.
And I don't really know how to wrestle with that, but I think George is right here that people do pick up on, at least at this time period, people do pick up on everything and they pick up on a feeling, and being able to trust their audience in that is, I don't know, a North Star, I guess.
Yeah, I think especially with a film like Revenge of the Sith, where you know ultimately where it's going, more or less, right?
Yeah.
Like, you know, he's going to become Darth Vader, and that does become your North Star. So the audience is anticipating everything leading to that. So in some ways, for a film like Revenge of the Sith, there is opportunity to take those shortcuts that George was talking about, because everyone is waiting for that moment of Anakin to fall to the dark side. And then that also kind of makes sense to his earlier quote too, of everything has to be cut down to what is most important to Anakin, or what he is experiencing in that moment, because he is this is his story. This is his fall. This is the moment.
Absolutely. Yeah, just to talk a little bit more about these scenes, the elevator antics, yes, loved that one, and escape through the hangar. This one is where the ship is being turned upside down. Anakin, Obi-Wan, and Palpatine are like walking on a pipe. It's really boring. I found this scene really boring. Yeah. I like where we netted out in the final cut, honestly, because anytime when Palpatine is traveling with Anakin and Obi-Wan, I feel like the whole thing is slowed down. Like physically.
You know what this reminds me of? It reminds me of the Clone Wars episode with Obi-Wan, Anakin, and Dooku. And Obi-Wan and Anakin are talking about how slow Dooku is because he's so old. And Dooku is in the back hating his life.
Yeah, they're like, old man, like they're trash talking.
And Dooku says something like, if I didn't have to drag your bodies because we're all handcuffed together, I would kill you on the spot.
Yeah, it's so true. I think that there's some fun R2-D2 stuff in this, that it was still an animatic, but overall I'm like, good riddance. Like, I'm glad you got that one out. But I do think, just to move on a little bit to the last invisible hand scene that was cut, there's a whole subplot with Shakti, and she dies twice in both of these deleted scenes. It's just really rough. And it's like the same death too. It's just dependent on who kills her through the heart with a lightsaber. In this scene, it's Grievous. And I guess this was filmed in August 2003, where Anakin and Obi-Wan come across Shakti in this hallway where they're caught in the ray shields. Later, they're caught in the ray shields in the final cut. And Shakti is held prisoner by Grievous. It's the first time that Anakin sees Grievous. Again, I just really like where we netted out in the final cut way better. I like when Anakin finally sees Grievous and they trash talk each other. And this is where Grievous says, "Stinking Jedi." What did you think of that?
Oh, I think it's funny.
I hate it. I'm not a fan. But then we get more finishing sentences with, after Shakti dies, Obi-Wan goes, "That was a bad," and Anakin goes, "Mistake," which doesn't really feel like those two words
that in character for them either. I don't know. This whole setup was a little awkward, I think. This is when they start miming the different signals to each other for certain moves, which I do think is fun. Obviously, the eyebrow rub, and they cut the circle through the floor, but they end up in the water. And all I could think about when watching this was how heavy those robes must have been while they were filming this. But this is the first scene that they include in the deleted scenes on the DVD, the 2005 Revenge of the Sith DVD. So there are little intros from George and Rick beforehand. And so since this was the first one, George says, scenes are deleted from a movie primarily because the movie is running long and we need to shorten things. So great intro. But Rick also says that this was a really complicated sequence and there was a lot going on in the opening sequence fully with the invisible hand. And he had a feeling early on that this particular sequence with Shaak Ti and Obi-Wan and Anakin down in the water would eventually get cut. This is where they also say that this first rescue of Palpatine was over an hour long.
Yeah, I think it's interesting that there was a feeling from Rick that it was going to get cut. I could tell when you read in the making of book and you come to see sort of the highlights of the different drafts, the rough draft, the first draft, the second draft of the scripts for Revenge of the Sith. The Shaak Ti stuff doesn't come in until I think the first draft, not the rough draft. And then it gets moved around a lot. There's stuff with Palpatine that gets changed up. And eventually I think that it was good that they cut out the Shaak Ti part from it. And it was just Anakin and Obi-Wan rescuing the Chancellor, encountering Grievous and Dooku. I mean, if it had anything more, I do feel like it would have been too many people and too much going on the ship. It's cool that there's a water feature in this opening, but it's just not needed. And I feel like it's more interesting to focus on the rescue of Palpatine, the relationship that Palpatine has with Anakin, the getting back to Coruscant, and like the ship battle, and just the fact that this is a space battle essentially.
Yeah, I agree. When I was watching it this time, when I was watching Revenge of the Sith, I found myself wondering if Palpatine was actually kind of scared when the invisible hand was crashing, right before another happy landing, because he looks real worried. And
I think he
I think
is.
so
I think
too.
he
He's
is.
thinking, oh my God, I have done all this work only to crash.
Yeah.
And I kind of wonder how concerned he actually was in that moment.
I know. I think he genuinely
I would
was,
be.
but then it probably made him more like Anakin is the next apprentice because he can do that, and I was in
He
danger,
saved
and
me
you
from
know
a
what I
crash
mean?
pad.
Yeah. Well, there's a couple of moments in I don't know if it's in the cutscene, I can't remember, but it's in the original script where Palpatine says a couple times like, "You saved my life, Anakin. I'm so happy. Like you saved my life."
Yeah.
And I do think there's a little bit of like, yeah, that danger was real, especially with the crashing of the ship.
But it's okay. It was another happy landing.
Yeah. Okay, moving on from the invisible hand scenes and into the Jedi cut scenes, which we've kind of just put all together here, just for sake of grouping them, because, like we said, there's a lot of scenes. Let's talk a little bit more about the Shaak Ti stuff. Again, poor Shaak Ti. I feel like the subplot with her got completely removed and then moved around again. So not only was her scene cut when she dies on the invisible hand, but then it was also cut with Anakin stabbing her in the back in the Jedi Temple. And so that's the scene that was added into the script April 2003, and it was the Shaak Ti being killed was I think the last shot ever filmed in September 2004. It's part of the last pickup shots on September 3rd, 2004. And Anakin comes across Shaak Ti in the Jedi Temple. It's mostly an animatic. He stabs her in the back. He said there's words that are she says, "What is it, Skywalker?" And then he stabs her and then walks away. And there's this, establishing shot of the Jedi Temple battle going on with the clones killing Jedi. And personally, I don't know about you, but I just feel like it's more effective that the only dialogue that is said in the Jedi Temple with Anakin during the massacre is the kids towards Anakin.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think we need to see anything else. I think that's the most dramatic. I think we see a lot of establishing shots of the clones carrying this out and Anakin walking into the temple. I don't think we needed this scene. It just feels a little egregious. Also, like at this point, it was sort of like, who is she almost,
Yeah.
to get her own scene here.
I don't think it was needed. And she's also kind of meditating, it almost looks like, in the scene. But the battle is already happening at the temple. The clones have already infiltrated, at least how they have it set up in the way they showed the deleted scene. So it feels kind of odd that she would be
For sure.
meditating
For sure.
when the clones are all attacking within the temple. And the way it looks is that Anakin kind of leaves directly from wherever she was and is, well inside the temple at that point. So anyway, it's a little messy, which makes sense too, because it doesn't seem like it was taken very far into development or finishing in post-production or anything like that. But yeah, it's kind of like we already have a lot going on and we don't need to see this as well from Anakin. All right, another deleted scene that we have with the Jedi, it's called A Plot to Destroy the Jedi. Very original name. And we basically have another version of this scene in the film, and it's Mace, Yoda, and Obi-Wan, and they're basically talking about the Chancellor and if they're going to have proof that the Chancellor is trying to consolidate power. And I do think it's funny because Yoda talks about speculation here in this version. Let me pull up the quote. I wrote it down. He says, on theories such as these, speculation is all we have. And I don't know. I just think that's really funny because who are we if not speculating? But they talk about needing proof to go to the council with their misgivings about Chancellor Palpatine, and that their proof will basically come once Grievous is killed. And if once that happens, then if the Chancellor doesn't give up his power, that'll be the proof we need to know that he's not a good guy. And on the DVD, George says in his intro, there was a lot more intriguing things going on, or he says there was a lot more intrigue going on with the council. This scene was really rewritten and put into a scene in the Jedi War Room where they have a similar discussion, and Mace describes his misgivings about what is going on.
Personally, I think if I want to juxtapose it with the scene of Mace, Obi-Wan, and Yoda in the clone ship, talking about sensing a plot to destroy the Jedi and everything, I think that scene is much better because this scene is in the shadowy room with the blinds drawn and things like that. And it's just a small quorum before they can go talk to the council about it. And I think the concept of the scene is good because it shows that there are members of the Jedi that aren't on the council who are thinking about the best plot forward given their suspicions. And I think all that makes sense, but I do think it potentially, as an audience member, could make you think that the Jedi are conspiring against Palpatine in this shadowy way, right? Just the staging of it means that it just looks secret. It looks, because it is secret, it looks suspicious, and we're already excluding Anakin, etc., right? But when we move the scene outside into the clone command ship, and it's brighter, it's lighter, it just is a little bit more good guy feeling, honestly. Even though they're discussing whether or not Anakin is even the chosen one, which I think is, I don't know, I think that's an interesting scene for sure. But I think just even changing the location of the scene and removing this one makes sense.
Yeah, I agree. And even to bring it back to Anakin, now the scene that we have is talking about Anakin, which, as we've been discussing, is ultimately the goal, to have everything focusing in on him more. So the scene where they are on the ship, where they get to basically kind of combine conversations, is ultimately better because, yes, they're talking about the bigger picture with the Chancellor and the Senate and the Republic and everything like that. But by having the conversation about Anakin, it's a reminder that all of this is eventually going to come down to Anakin and his choices as well.
Mm-hmm. It feels like the scene was cut pretty early in March 2003.
Mm-hmm.
So the next deleted scene we have is Jedi imposters at the temple, which is we have imposter clones standing outside the Jedi temple when Obi-Wan and Yoda arrive. And personally, I found this scene more interesting to me in 2025 than it was to me in 2005. Now having the clone backstory and everything, I kind of like the way it's filmed. I think it's interesting that the clones would
put on Jedi robes
and just be Jedi imposters. Fascinating. What did you think about this one?
Yeah, I didn't remember this scene at all, which
Me
makes
neither.
sense because, our infamously not clone people until the last 2 years, I would say.
Exactly.
So this was really fascinating to me to see, the clones in disguise, but they're all still clones. I don't know. It felt kind of dumb for the clones to do That when obviously the Jedi
to Obi-Wan and Yoda,
would
like
be
they
able
know.
to sense, and the clones aren't dumb. So I think this was definitely the right call to get rid of this. And we see this scene, but the clones are in their armor when it happens.
When Obi-Wan says, "You clones make terrible Jedi," I was like, oh wow, that's
Ouch, yeah.
we're trash
Aren't you a little more
talking.
concerned
Yeah.
about what's happening here, Obi-Wan?
Yeah, I'm glad they cut it, but it was interesting.
Yeah.
I don't know. More interesting to me now than it ever was.
It definitely could have been something that was developed
It needed to be fleshed
further
out.
in the Clone
Yeah.
Wars and in the Bad Batch later, but existing on by itself within Revenge of the Sith, it was good they changed it.
So the next few scenes are Yoda centric. So Exile to Dagobah. It's a scene in which Yoda gets off his little pod, which he left in Kashyyyk, and gets off on Dagobah. We have an establishing shot that shows Dagobah, the swampland, and everything. And I believe this would have been part of the montage before seeing baby Luke and baby Leia go to their new homes in the finale. And personally, I know people love this and really wish it was in the movie, but I think going back to that focus on Anakin, I don't really care that much about Yoda getting to Dagobah, honestly. I feel like it's sort of a who cares type of moment. I think we know that Yoda goes to Dagobah. We know that Luke finds him on Dagobah. I don't really need to see Yoda going there.
Yeah.
Personally.
In the making of book, this scene is still in the cut of the film as of October 2004. And
super late.
Yeah, in the making of, when they're talking about some of the animation around this moment, George says, George is asked if Yoda looks too sad in the version of the animation of him arriving on Dagobah, and George says, yeah, Yoda should bring his head up faster. He should look around because this is his new world. I think the word here is wise. Yoda has to have a "we will have our day" look on his face. He is going to persevere. Then on the DVD extras on the 2005 DVD, Rick McCallum says it was one of the most painful things to cut out of the movie. He says, I was heartbroken. I begged George not to do it. And then George goes on to say, looking at the film, we realized that it was more important to follow the thread of the children and not the thread of all the characters. First, we deal with the mother, then the father, then the children. Putting Yoda in there was a bit of unnecessary exposition. We know where he ends up. And then it cuts back to Rick and he says, but I love that shot.
And the shot's great.
It is.
It's good. It just doesn't fit.
It is. But what I thought was funny is that Rick also says, he talks about the future when George is inevitably tinkering with Revenge of the Sith years after it's come out, kind of like a special edition. And maybe he'll think about putting it back in. But then he also adds, but I'm happy people get to see it on the DVD here.
Yeah, that's it.
Yeah, I think it was the right call as well, kind of for the reasons George Lucas himself talked about. I agree with you, George. and that you were saying it again, this is Anakin's story, and so now we're following the two of them, Luke and Leia, and to end it with them on Alderaan and Tatooine, that is the hopeful ending. It's the perfect lead-in to A New Hope, and anything else would have been disruptive.
It is interesting because when you read the making of book, George constantly, and was telling the press this at the time too, that the movie's going to be a bummer.
Yeah.
It's really dark. There's every time he gives a different draft, he's like, we're in a really dark place. This movie is rough. And I think it's just really important then to focus on the hopefulness. And so I think spotlighting whether or not Yoda looks really sad here is the right questions to ask, because we have to leave the movie theater feeling hopeful. And I did. And I think that they achieved that with this perfect ending, in my opinion. When I was, I haven't brought this up yet, but I went through the Jedi Council forums in fascinatingly, there was a thread in April 2005. This movie came out May 19th, 2005. It's very easy to forget that spoiler culture was not a thing for the prequels at all. The novelization has been out at this time period in April 2005, and somewhere it was released, I think on StarWars.com, what shots were cut and what shots were not. So we had people in the fandom who had read this truly fantastic novelization by Matthew Stover, and fell in love with so many of these subplots, these little scenes and things like that, including the Yoda part. And people were already annoyed with what was cut without having seen the final cut of the movie. And I think it's just absolutely fascinating that we had a whole fandom get so obsessed with the genius novelization and get attached to scenes because of the imagination aspect that happens when you read a book, especially a book that's, I can't stop talking about how amazing that book is. But I think it's interesting because in April 2005, people were like, the ending's going to feel so rushed without Yoda. The ending has to have Yoda in it.
Well, and
It doesn't.
the making of book was also out as well. It came out in April 2005
Yes.
too. So it's like they just had all this information. It's crazy to consider.
It was all out. And J.W. Rinsler stopped writing the making of book in, I think it's October 2004. So the making of kind of ceases then. And so we don't really know what happens after, and everything can be pieced together by releases done on StarWars.com, there was a lot. So it's fascinating to dive back into that time period of people arguing about a movie that they haven't seen yet, but they have all this information about the movie, basically the script. So
it would have, if I can't imagine what Sky Talkers would have been doing if we had the making of The Last Jedi before The Last Jedi came out, or even the making of The Rise of Skywalker as kind of like the final piece before The Rise of Skywalker came out. You know, it's just, it's wild to think that that would be a part of the lead up in today's movie making world.
Spoiler culture. Yeah. It's fascinating. We also have another scene with Yoda communicating with Qui-Gon. And I think I could be wrong about this, but the vibe I got from the making of book was that this idea of Yoda communicating with Qui-Gon, it's basically an animatic. The only thing that exists within it that's real is Bail Organa being superimposed within it, saying, you know, Obi-Wan Kenobi has made contact. That's in the movie. And it's basically a disembodied, not Liam Neeson voice of communicating with Qui-Gon. And the quote is interesting. I kind of wanted to talk about it a little bit. So it's Qui-Gon saying, "You will learn to merge with the Force at will. Your physical self will fade away, but you will still retain your consciousness. You'll become more powerful than any Jedi could imagine." I liked that this line was flying in the face, that final one of, "You will become more powerful than any Jedi could imagine." It's flying in the face of Anakin saying, "I have become more powerful than any Jedi could ever dream of," to Padmé on Mustafar. And it just really shows that Anakin really has no idea about really what was possible through the cosmic force. And I just don't really get why they cut this, because I don't think it would have changed that much or added or taken away anything by having this line from Qui-Gon when Yoda is meditating in that scene anyway. What did you think about this?
I think it kind of goes back to why they cut him arriving on Dagobah. It's kind of this exposition with Yoda that is not necessary at this point in the film, because you're kind of coming off, you're being brought down from the emotion of Mustafar and everything that happened there. And this feels, I don't want to say like too juicy, but it is kind of, I don't know, it feels distracting from the emotional beats of what's happening at the end here, because the scene exists. We just don't have Liam Neeson's voice in it, essentially. And we just see Yoda meditating. That's what it looks like. And then, you know, they say Obi-Wan has arrived. And then we do have Yoda say that, you know, Qui-Gon, he'll be having lessons from Qui-Gon, basically on Tatooine. But I think anything more than that, I do think it kind of becomes a distraction. However, I do think that it is an interesting comparison, like you pointed out, to what Anakin says, and the fact that Qui-Gon, the man who found him on Tatooine, was someone who maybe would have had the kind of knowledge Anakin was even seeking to save Padmé if, you know, the circumstances had been different, is like tragic irony, right? That the person he could have turned to or sought out in the Force of Qui-Gon could have actually helped him as opposed to Palpatine. I do think that's an interesting facet, but I think it was ultimately the right call to cut this.
I don't disagree. It also has left leeway for such an incredible 3-part episode of Yoda communicating with Qui-Gon in the Clone Wars So good. Just a reminder that Yoda does talk to Obi-Wan around Qui-Gon, though, at the very end here, too. So I feel like there could, I don't know. I agree with cutting it, but I do feel like potentially even that part feels even more random.
Yeah, a little bit.
It does, in my opinion. Like when we're watching it, I'm like, okay, he's gonna talk to Qui-Gon. All right. I mean, I think that does solve the issue of how does Obi-Wan disappear in A New Hope when he dies. I think that's the thing that they're trying to stitch together here. But I think it would have been cool to have it. I ultimately agree with them cutting it, and I think it's fine. It's better for Yoda to be meditating there and just kind of focusing on the future, I guess, as that's what you think of as an audience member. But yeah, it's kind of sad it didn't happen.
Yeah, I agree. And it's definitely feels even more out of place watching it since it's not Liam Neeson's voice, but it's supposed to be
Yeah.
Qui-Gon Jinn.
Yeah, it's so funny. Okay, anything else to say about the Jedi cut scenes or the invisible hand scenes?
I don't think so.
Okay, let's move on to part 2. So welcome to part 2 where we're talking about the Seeds of Rebellion cut plot. So this is sort of the entire reason why I wanted to do this episode, because I felt like, you felt like, we all felt like these are the things that people talk about the most from the Revenge of the Sith deleted scenes. And it's really difficult to track down when this subplot was added to the drafts. I don't have access to the scripts, but I feel like it's not mentioned entirely in the making of book, the J.W. Rinsler making of book. So we have a rough timeline of the art department beginning concepting in June 2002. January 2003, the script rough draft is written and passed around to the art department after at long last. Everyone's asking for it for months and months and months. And then we have the real first draft that comes into play in April. So that's 3 months later or 4 months later from the rough draft. And then we have the second draft by June. And so there's just a lot of things that are changing and being rewritten. And I just share that because this is a month-long process. And through that process, there isn't really a lot of Padmé being fleshed out. Her story is just not fully there. I think there's several problems that I think George has to solve with what comes next in A New Hope. There was questions that were being thrown around about whether or not even Padmé would be pregnant in this episode, if she would give birth by the end, what her role would be. They were talking about how many scenes would be on Naboo. Like Naboo was a major fixture in the concepting, and they have a ton of art around Anakin and Padmé meeting on Naboo, which I think is interesting, obviously, as an Annie Dalla fan. But I think that all that comes from a place of them not really knowing, them meaning George Lucas, not really knowing what to do with this subplot. And it's not really until the second draft in June 2003 that finally adds that Palpatine insinuates to Anakin that Obi-Wan was meeting clandestinely with Padmé. So what emerges is a subplot, and I think this is part of the Seeds of Rebellion subplot. That's why I'm mentioning this. What emerges is a subplot of Palpatine seeding deception that Anakin should cast on Padmé and whether or not she is hiding something from Anakin. And so these scenes were allegedly shot in July 2003. It really isn't mentioned anywhere in the making of as part of the drafts, like I mentioned. And I don't really know what to think because part of me thinks that it was a last minute addition or just something that came together in one of the later drafts. But they did build the sets, and it takes a while for them to build the sets. And they really concepted Bail Organa's office and things like that.
So I only have one date about when some of the Padmé plot was cut, and the Seeds of the Rebellion scene that takes place in Padmé's apartment. The making of book notes that this was cut, was part of a group that was cut between November 5th and November 20th, 2003. So fairly late into 2003. Obviously, we still have another year and a half before the film comes out, but this feels kind of like right in the middle of when they're in post-production and kind of starting to put all of the pieces together. And George has another quote kind of about why they ended up cutting a lot of the Padmé plot from the DVD. He says, Quote, ultimately, we decided that it was very important to focus on Anakin's story, so it was with the regrets that I had to let that whole subplot go. So the first scene in that series is where Padmé is introduced to the Rebel Alliance, a group of senators that got together and decided that they needed to be a loyal opposition, so to speak, to the Chancellor and the types of proposals that were being made, because everything seemed to be going through the Senate too quickly and nobody realized what was happening in terms of continuing power that the Chancellor was gathering up. This was a group that said enough is enough and we got to stop them. We got to start voting against these things and we got to get others to work with us. He also says that, and you already mentioned this, Charlotte, but that part of this subplot too was Palpatine working. He says, quote, Palpatine is working to subvert Anakin's trust in Padmé. And this one is really kind of highlighted in the presentation of the petition of the 2000 to Palpatine, which we'll talk about. But yeah, everything around this whole plot. I think there's another part where George talks about like it's supposed to be paralleling Anakin's as far as Padmé being brought more into what is becoming the rebellion and Anakin being pulled away from her and Obi-Wan and obviously seduced by Palpatine. But like we've been talking about, George decided that all of that extra had to go in order to just keep it on Anakin.
Which I get. And I do
Mhm.
think that some of the complaints, I would say, of Attack the Clones and The Phantom Menace was that there was maybe too much politics. And I think if you were to peel things back, maybe this would be one to go. And it was one to go.
It's interesting because in 2025, I'm like, oh, it would have been great to have this whole plot still here. And
These scenes hit so hard. It is crazy.
they really do. And I think even just as fans continuing to love this franchise, 20 plus years later, 40 plus years, whatever it is, that having this whole plot with Padmé and the rebellion and, the Senate and what they're doing and the Chancellor grabbing up more and more power, changing the Constitution, it's like, oh, the ways that this plot would have connected to things like Andor, to Rogue One, even within the Clone Wars and different novels and things like that. It's just interesting that we would have had so much more built out with the Senate and, the politics of it all, which is kind of crazy. Like you said, this is such a common critique for Star Wars and the prequels is too much politics. And here I am saying, but what if they had left it in? What if we had more?
Well, I mean, it really is Genevieve O'Reilly's first appearance as Mon Mothma.
Yeah.
And it was cut. And now we have Genevieve O'Reilly as Mon Mothma in several different parts of Star Wars. It is crazy. I think I had said that there were 3 scenes as part of the Seeds of Rebellion cut plot, but I think we had included 4 here as part of this grouping. And we added in when this changes to the Constitution. So let's go through them. This changes to the Constitution scene, and it's where in the Senate chambers, Palpatine is telling Anakin that, quote, this afternoon the Senate is going to call on me to take direct control of the Jedi Council. And the Senate is too unfocused to conduct a war. This will bring a quick end to things. And Anakin's a little unsteady around it, and Palpatine assures him, there are times we must endure adjustments to the Constitution in the name of security. And again, Anakin is still unsure and says, with all due respect, sir, the council is in no mood for more constitutional amendments. And basically, it is the beginning of a scene that exists in the movie, which is when Palpatine asks Anakin to be the eyes and ears of the Jedi for him on the Jedi Council, which we know is a huge part of Anakin's downfall. But it starts off with this discussion of Palpatine knowing what the Senate is going to do to allow Palpatine to have even more power over all the branches of the Republic. Any thoughts on this scene?
I think I have too many thoughts on this
I know.
scene. It's not even thoughts. It's just, well, look at some things being said.
If you guys haven't watched this one recently, please fire it on up. It is crazy. It's a crazy
Me
one.
saying maybe there should be more politics in Star Wars so people can hear some of this stuff from Emperor Palpatine. I think I don't want to say if I had to pick, this is one I would want back in. I think I'm speaking from a place of like right now kind of vibe, but I do like that there is kind of more conversation between Anakin and Palpatine about the politics of what is happening, because Padme is going to be coming directly against what Palpatine is talking about here with the Senate and wanting to have more power. And the way that he says, thank you, my friend, but in this case, I have no choice. This war must be won. And Anakin says, everyone will agree on that. And so Anakin is kind of conceding that Palpatine's decisions to kind of accumulate more power so things don't have to go through the Senate as often is the right choice. And that's obviously what Padme and Bail and Mon Mothma are trying to prevent. And I do think that it's good to put Anakin in the middle of that, which is kind of part of the whole point of this plot. But once you start taking out some of these other scenes, this one kind of has to go too. And really the most important part of this scene, which is a version that now exists in the film, is what you were saying, Charlotte, of Palpatine, asking Anakin to be his eyes and ears, and that, oh, it's such a shame, the council doesn't trust you, and you're really great. I really like you. You're my fave.
Yeah, it's a lot. It's a lot. But I think we included in this because it just really shows this distrust that is just growing with Anakin to everyone around him. And then the next scene that is cut is in Bail's apartment. Bail talks about the decree to install regional governors to oversee all the decisions, which is basically overriding the Senate as it exists now. And all of this they're like, the decree was posted this morning. It's happening. So my comment on that is that I think the previous scene that we just talked about should have included that part about the regional governors or the governors that would overwrite the Senate. Yeah. And just because I find some of this, it's either this all of these scenes, you can't just take out one because they all build on each other. Yeah. So I understand why this large chunk has moved. And basically they're talking about a rebellion, and what is happening is Padme's like, I can't believe it has come to this. Chancellor Palpatine was one of my oldest advisors. He served as my ambassador when I was queen. And then another senator goes, Senator, I fear you have underestimated the amount of corruption that has taken hold in the Senate. Mon says, the chancellor has played the senators well. They know where the power lies, and they will do whatever it takes to have their share in it. So I thought there's a couple things happening here. First, Padme calling out that she can't believe what has happened with Chancellor Palpatine and him taking power and just them being assembling a group that will eventually go against him. And I think it's really good to call out in this last episode of the prequel trilogy something that we have talked about many times on Sky Talkers, which is this line that exists between Palpatine and Padme. They're both from the same planet. In a lot of ways, Palpatine has manipulated Padme too. So her having this moment, I think, was really important. And then I think Mon referring to the fact that there are going to be senators who jump on this switch up in power, I also think is really interesting. It's just a simple line, but it just shows that it's not like all the senators are against Palpatine and this concept of the governors taking control of what the Senate used to do, right? So when Bail is like, we can't continue debating this any longer. We have decided that we have decided to do what we can to stop it. Senator Mon Mothma and I are putting together an organization, and Padme cuts them off. She says, say no more, Senator. I understand. At this point, some things are better left unsaid. And from that, I was thinking about how George Lucas was like, okay, let them figure it out. Let the audience figure it out, because as this scene exists, no one is saying anything about a rebel alliance. No one is saying anything about a rebellion. Everyone's just saying something around getting a group of people together to petition Palpatine to remove his emergency powers. And Padme saying, don't say it out loud, I thought was interesting. So what did you think about this scene?
This is definitely a scene that still feels canon in a lot of ways, because where you left off on the scene, Padme says, some things are better left unsaid. And Bail says, agreed. So we will not discuss this with anyone without everyone in this group agreeing. And Mon Mothma says, that means those closest to you, even family. No one can be told. And the scene ends on Padme kind of hesitating. And then she agrees to what Mon Mothma has said. But of course, now you're thinking about Mon Mothma in the show Andor and everything that she has never been able to tell her husband and her daughter. And we hate her husband, but he's also been left in the dark about everything. And
Yeah.
I just think that this is really interesting because, yes, to your point, like they're talking about the petition, but they're also talking about the Rebel Alliance and what will become that. And obviously, it's not even named at this point. It's not even imagined in the way that it will eventually become with Mon Mothma leading it. You know what I mean? And I also, when you were talking about it, I was really thinking through like how we would analyze this scene if it was actually in the movie, along with the rest of this plot. And when you were talking about, it's good that Padme has this line about Palpatine being one of her advisors. I agree with you. And it also made me think about how, wow, this really would have also really upped the reputation of Padme as far as the senators, because for Bail and Mon Mothma to know, would have known, obviously, that she was close to Palpatine. So for them to still think that she was the type of person that would not agree with what was happening and kind of see reason in what was going on against someone who she does have such a close relationship with, I think it says a lot about her as a character. Whereas Anakin does kind of the opposite when, Obi-Wan talks to him about spying on the Chancellor, and he has a very emotional, negative reaction to it. And here are two people going to Padme also about someone she trusts, Palpatine, and saying, something is wrong here. And she's saying, okay, let me listen. Let me hear what's going on. So I think that also would have been an interesting point of comparison between Padme and Anakin as far as their relationships to Palpatine. But I think what we've been talking about with all of these scenes is it kind of is like once you start taking out one, the others kind of start falling by the wayside as far as being able to connect the dots between what is going on between all of them, especially like what you were talking about with the governors and them taking control from all of Palpatine's like executive orders and amendments to the Constitution and things like that. So it's a good scene.
Right. Yeah.
It's a good scene.
Yeah, it is a good scene. And I think I really like what you just said about juxtaposing the two aspects of spying against each other. Anakin spying for Palpatine, Padme conspiring with a group of senators to go against Palpatine. That exists in the novel, and it is really good. And to me, this is something that just works perfectly in a novel, and that brings us to the next scene too, which is in Padme's apartment called Seeds of Rebellion. And Padme and crew gather in her apartment about the delegation of 2000. Padme says that she wants to discuss the matter of a petitioning Palpatine to remove his emergency powers with a Jedi, and she says, one I trust. And I think what really sticks out to me in this scene personally is, so she's obviously concerned about whether or not they're going to have the support of people in this petition and this delegation. And Padme is wondering if she can maybe get more allies by talking with the Jedi. And when she says this, we think she probably wants to talk to Anakin about this, especially because I think we get a sense through their marriage that Anakin thinks that Padme is hiding something. And in the novelization, what is actually revealed is Padme's internal monologue reveals that she doesn't know when she says, I would like to bring a Jedi, one I trust, into this. She doesn't know if she means Anakin or Obi-Wan, which is like, it's a mic drop moment in the book.
I think this is really funny too, because in the DVD, George references her telling Anakin specifically. But then in the making of book, the scene is described as, quote, Bail Organa and the other scenes discourage Padme from talking to Obi-Wan about their plan to present Palpatine, which this is fascinating that we have the DVD and the making of referencing different people as well. And we know that George Lucas had such a hand in all of the details in the Revenge of the Sith novelization. So it makes sense that then in the book, Padme doesn't know if she means Anakin or Obi-Wan. And it
because no one knows either.
And it's funny how we have different answers in different resources about the movie.
And I think that just is intrinsic to the story of distrust that we're telling in Revenge of the Sith. I don't think that we even needed to decide, right? I think there's a moment that what we're experiencing here is Padme feeling the weight of the pressure of the secrecy around this and wanting some support there, but then not really knowing who to turn to for that.
Yeah. And that, she's got if Obi-Wan is in her mind about it, then it makes her question why it isn't Anakin
Yep.
automatically. So it all goes into the greater themes.
It's really good.
Yeah.
It's really good. So then the next one is the presentation of the petition to Palpatine, which is quite the scene. This is the one that's not on Disney Plus, which is crazy because if you have these other two and then they just
No, the
end.
Bail one in Bail's office also isn't on Disney Plus. It's just
What?
Seeds of the Rebellion.
That was
It doesn't make
crazy.
any sense. And I don't think Changes to the Constitution is on Disney Plus either. I could be
Crazy.
wrong about that one, but yeah, there's only one. I think it's only Padmé's the Seeds of the Rebellion scene that is on Disney Plus.
So Palpatine says, I understand your concerns, and I assure you the governors will not compete with the duties of the Senate. And the way that the scene is staged is all the senators are sitting in Palpatine's office, Palpatine's at his desk, and Anakin is the protective bodyguard behind Palpatine. It is a perfect stage, honestly, of Anakin having to meet Padmé's gaze, but then always looking down because I think he feels sort of ashamed that he's on one side versus the side of his wife. And so Padmé presses him, says, may I take then? There will be no further amendments to the Constitution. Palpatine says that he'll stop when the conflict ends. He says, when it does, there will be an immediate return to democracy.
Which is not an answer.
Padmé says, no, it's not an answer. Padmé says, you are pursuing a diplomatic solution then to the war. Palpatine says, you must trust me to do the right things, Senator. That is why I'm here. And another senator goes, but surely, and Palpatine interrupts him and says, I said I'll do what is right, and that should be enough for your committee. And Padmé leaves with a look. She stands up and she leaves with a look that personally can only be described as throwing daggers at Anakin, and he looks sheepishly at the floor after her gaze. It is really funny.
He was sleeping in the Jedi Temple that night.
Yes, that's exactly what the vibe was. And immediately, the senators aren't even out of the room yet. And Palpatine is already talking to Anakin about what happened and is trying to change the narrative of whatever Anakin is thinking. He says, their sincerity is to be admired, although I sense there is more to the request and they're not telling us. Anakin goes, what do you mean? He says, they're not to be trusted. And Anakin is like, well, surely Senator Amidala can be trusted.
He's so bad at this whole marriage secret keeping. There's 10 senators in there. He's like, well, what about this one is probably fine, right? The pretty one.
And Palpatine goes, these are unstable times for the Republic. Some see instability as an opportunity. Senator Amidala is hiding something. I can see it in her eyes. And he says, I'm sure you're mistaken. Palpatine says, I'm surprised your Jedi insights aren't sensitive to such things. I simply don't sense betrayal in Senator Amidala, Anakin says. Palpatine goes, but you don't want to admit it. There is much conflict in you, Anakin. And so there's a couple things going on there. I think when Palpatine says, you don't sense that Senator Amidala is hiding something, when I was younger, I was like, I think Anakin could cover that up, be like, oh, well, she's obviously hiding. One, she's pregnant. Second, we are married. And that was just really awkward. So maybe that's what you're sensing. But I think then his mind goes to, what else is she hiding? Maybe Anakin didn't even know about this petition until this moment, right?
Yeah. Well, because, in the other scene, Mon Mothma says you can't tell anyone, even your family. And Padmé agrees. Yeah, I was thinking while you were talking again, I was thinking about how we would analyze this scene if it were still the movie. And this is definitely a departure from Attack of the Clones, right? When Anakin and Padmé go back to Naboo, they're talking to the Queen, and Anakin keeps inserting himself into the conversation. And he's standing behind Padmé the way that he's standing behind Palpatine in this scene. Like you said, the bodyguard image of it. And in that scene, he's, like I said, he's inserting himself into the conversation when he doesn't need to be. And even though Padmé is upset, obviously, in Attack of the Clones, I feel like in this scene, she wants him to say something, and he's just standing there silently. And this is the difference, is that Palpatine is the wedge between them, and that is his intent in all of this. And even here at the end, where he's continuing to sow the seeds of doubt of Anakin to Padme.
Yeah, it's fascinating. I think that subplot, I love the fact that we can trace the origins of the Rebel Alliance to Mon Mothma, Padme, and Bail Organa. I think that is really cool. But I think Palpatine sowing the doubt of Padme to Anakin is potentially more interesting to me. And I think that's a loss.
Especially when we get to the end, when Obi-Wan or when Anakin, when they all arrive on Mustafar and, he says, you're with him, you've turned her against me. That all, I think, would be more discernible, I think, if some of these elements had stayed. And even that bonus scene that you were talking about between Obi-Wan and Padme, that one line from Anakin, I think, would have just been emphasized in a different way. Whereas I think sometimes it can kind of feel like it comes out of left field based off of how the film reads now.
Yeah, I think it just kind of speaks to sort of my frustration with how Padme's storyline is approached in this movie. It's really difficult, and it's something like I feel like I don't really talk about that much on the show. It's something Caitlin and I were talking about before we were recording. But like I mentioned earlier, it is very clear that George had like no idea what to do with Padme in the screenplay, and that he had several things to deal with. And I think what's frustrating is that this is an interesting part. These deleted scenes are an interesting thing, and then they don't really serve Anakin's story in a 2-hour way, so they're cut. And I understand it, because I do think it would slow it down, and I do think the pacing of Revenge of the Sith is actually perfect. It's my favorite Star Wars movie, but I do find when I'm reading these making of books, like, it's so hard to find anything about what anyone was thinking about the character of Padmé Amidala. It is rough. And it's a rough thing when you're a fan. And I just wanted to read this quote, actually, around this is just sort of separate, of course, from all of this, all of the deleted scenes, but I think it just kind of speaks to George Lucas's struggle. And I just want to be clear, I understand the struggle, because I think from a visionary director standpoint and the way that George Lucas works, I think that this has always been a weak point for him. And this being the relationship between Anakin and Padme. It works for me, but I feel like it doesn't work for everybody. And I'm just going to read this quote. Showing how much Anakin and Padme care for each other is one of my weak points. Expressing that is hard to do. It's really hard in the end to express the idea, I'm so in love with you that I would do anything to save you. I'd give up everything, friends, my whole life, for you. And make that stick, and say it in 2 minutes, which is all the time this film has for it. If I had a whole movie, I could probably manage it, but I can't go deeper into the psyche of these people beyond a certain stylistic reality I've created for myself. It wouldn't work. It's also a very difficult structural issue. And when I created it, I knew I wanted to do 2 hard right turns. It's designed that way. And I knew I was taking a real chance that it wasn't going to work. But you have to see if you can make it work. And if it doesn't, well, I'm going to get skewered for it. But if I can make it work, it'll be neat. It'll be good. I think that eventually he did make it work, but I think when you see these scenes, it just leaves a little bit to be desired based off of this like doubt plot that was seeded throughout Anakin and Padme's relationship in Revenge of the Sith. Again, when you read the making of book, there's so many points in which even comments around Natalie Portman talking to George around, does Padme clue into Anakin's change, and how am I supposed to show that, and when am I supposed to show that, and things like that. It just feels like there's a little bit of a lack of knowing. And again, I'm pretty forgiving of the lack of knowing, because I think that's the process that has worked for George Lucas thus far. But I love these scenes so much that it's hard to not be like, well, maybe this would have been the bomb that would have fixed the quote unquote problem of not really knowing what to do with Padme in this episode. Do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, I think looking at the whole timeline of the movie, this represents, I don't know, maybe 7 to 10 minutes total. And I think when we're looking at it 20 years later, you think that's really not that much time in the grand scheme of things. 10 minutes is probably being generous also. It's probably closer 5 to 7, I would say, total between all of these scenes. And it feels, I don't know, it feels like they should have gone in. And I think when we think about the character development of Padme on her own, that these belonged there. And it feels unfair that the woman character had to have her entire plot cut from this movie. But I think when you take a step back and are looking at it from George's perspective of keeping the focus on Anakin, it starts to make sense within the film itself. But I do think sometimes when we're looking at the franchise as a whole and the entire saga, it's like, no, this probably would have been more important to keep in than some of the other things in the movie, or maybe cutting down some of the action scenes that were going on. I think you had sent me some of the Jedi Council forum comments maybe about this with like everything happening on Kashyyyk. And it was like, did we need all of that on Kashyyyk when we could have had some of this? I don't know. It would have been an interesting conversation to have if the point is to focus more on Anakin. So then what is the comparison between something like a longer Kashyyyk sequence versus some of these moments of Seeds of the Rebellion? And it does feel like they're just like, why was this deprioritized? Maybe it was because George just didn't feel like it was his strength, or it wasn't aiding, it was distracting from Anakin or something like that. But It I do, as we've been talking through it, I find myself wishing more that it was still included. I think I started this conversation with, yeah, some of these are fun, but I understand why they were cut. And now going through it and really kind of thinking about how they fit into the movie, how they would have fit into our larger understanding of a lot of these characters, it's like, maybe I will just start assuming some of these are canon until told otherwise.
Yeah. No, for sure. I definitely consider this
Yeah.
canon. There's no doubt about it. I think when George says I was focusing on 2 heel turns,
Right.
what are those heel turns? I would say maybe the heel turn is the dream,
Mm-hmm.
and then the first dream, and then the Jedi Council snub and secrecy around that. But I'm not sure.
I'm not either, because heel turn just, it sounds so dramatic. And both of those are dramatic moments.
There's only one heel turn. The one heel turn is when he turns to the dark side.
Yeah, that's the heel turn.
Is the next heel turn when he chokes Padme?
Read that part of his quote again.
So he doesn't say heel turn. He says 2 right turns. Okay, I'll say it again. He says, it's also a very difficult structural issue. And when I created it, I wanted 2 hard right turns. It's designed to be that way. And I knew I was taking a real chance if it wasn't going to work. But you have to see if you can make it work. If it doesn't, well, I'm going to get skewered for it. So 2 hard right turns. What are the hard right turns?
I know what George Lucas is considering his hard right turns in a movie that we already know Anakin is falling to the dark side.
I think it's the second thing that I said, which are Anakin turning to the dark side and choking Padme, because those are the points where it's like, oh, we're really following this path. And is he going to pull back from this? And how can he pull back from this? And when he turns to the dark side, there's a period in the movie, especially when he talks to Padme, where there's a chance that, and you see him crying on Mustafar, that there's a chance of him turning back. And then once he chokes Padme, it's a no, because that's when we dive into the fight between Obi-Wan and Anakin. That is very personal.
Yeah. I also think maybe you're right too, though, about the dream, because that sets the path, has been decided, of he's got to do anything possible to make sure that doesn't come true.
Both theories that we both presented, right, are, one of them includes Padme and her devotion to Anakin, or Anakin's devotion to Padme, right? Their devotion to each other.
Yeah.
And so in which way does the delegation of 2000 support that? And it's hard to say it fully does.
But if the whole point of all of these scenes together is to show them going on different paths, I think big picture, these scenes,
it does make sense. That's why it's a perfect book scene.
Because individually the petition, or Seeds of the Rebellion scene isn't supporting that, but when you have all of them connected, it is that parallel to Anakin's story, and it is Palpatine sowing that distrust between them, which makes it more obsessive. It makes feelings of betrayal more likely, the paranoia, which
Mhm.
culminates in Anakin choking Padme at the end.
And the reason why he chokes Padme is because of the distrust that he feels like she betrayed him by bringing Obi-Wan to kill him.
Mhm. And the tragedy is she didn't.
She didn't even know.
Yeah. So I think we're gonna need a
When they were
special
filming
edition.
when they were filming that. Yes, we really do. We might get it. You never know. When they were filming that final scene of the Force choke and everything, it's funny to not funny. Oh my God, it's not funny. But to read the making of and the description of the scene, it's like, this is the scene. This is the most pivotal scene. George Lucas was like, everyone who doesn't need to be here, get off the set. And they have an interesting line. Rinsler, these little moments of, it's just fascinating to think about actors on the scene and thinking about their characters and things like that, that Rinsler seeds through this book. He says that through this scene, when they called cut and reset and redid the makeup and things like that, Hayden stayed in character and like put his head down and like muttered the whole time. Isn't that crazy? I know. But it makes sense. I mean, the reason why Hayden Christensen was hired is literally that scene, is to see that darkness in him when his eyes sort of light up around the make things the way we want them to be scene. That's it. And so it's so important. That scene is so important. So again, I think that is one of the right turns.
Yeah, I think you're right too. And, I do still have hope that maybe references to these scenes could happen in Andor season 2 as we're getting closer to the actual formation of the Rebel Alliance, that Mon Mothma or even Bail perhaps could say something referencing Padme by name and some of these movements that they started back in this timeline. Back in this time period.
The upcoming book, The Mask of Fear, I think also includes allusions to this too.
Yeah,
so
that's
it'll be
true.
interesting to see how it fits into the canon now. I think it might be word for word.
That would be great, because then I think then we would have an even better chance of maybe having these in a special edition cut.
Heck yeah.
And you know what? I'll even let Rick put in, actually, I'm not going to say I'll even let Rick put back in the Yoda scene, but I think
No,
Caitlin,
no. The mother, the father, the son,
daughter.
or the daughter, the son is the
That's why I said I take
perfect
it back.
thing.
I'm not going to let him.
Yeah. No, he's not allowed.
I'm sorry, Rick. I know you love it. It is a good scene.
You can still come to my Star Wars dinner party.
We're sorry, Rick. We'll put it up we'll create a special cut for you with it in.
Yeah. Okay, great scenes. Let's talk about the animatic.
Listen, big deal. You got another problem. Women always figure out the truth. Always.
Okay, so welcome to part 3 where we're talking about the animatics. So on Disney Plus, there's a ton of animatics. There's the Utapau Chase animatic, there's the Kashyyyk animatic, there's a longer extended version of the Mustafar duel, and then a longer extended version of the Senate duel. It's kind of uninteresting to talk through the animatics, but one thing that is unfortunately, but they're so pivotal in the filmmaking process. It is a huge part of the making of books, all of them. And the most fascinating part of it is that Steven Spielberg was brought in as a, quote, guest director.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, it's so funny. So things were kind of heating up. George didn't have the next draft yet. He's really late on writing it, and he comes into the writing room on like a Friday and he's an hour late to this meeting, and he's like, guys, I'm going to bring in a guest director. It's a big one. Just think about it all weekend. And then he leaves.
Do you think anyone was
That's basically the gist of what happened. Yeah, so then everyone was abuzz around it, and it was Steven Spielberg. And here's the quote. Steven came to be involved in the animatics because we had new technology and I was talking to him about it. I said how great it was and I showed it to him. His film had fallen out over the summer, so I said, we'll give you a laptop and we'll give you the program and I'll give you the scenes. You can direct the scenes while you're sitting by the pool. He loves to do that stuff. And then he says, we have very, very similar sensibilities.
It's funny.
So throughout the making of book, it's actually funny because you see all these people who come into the space at Skywalker Ranch or in Australia or in England or in San Rafael for ILM. And George is bringing his buddies around. But what he's really showing them all, including Francis Ford Coppola and Robert Rodriguez, is how the animatic system works and how to use it. And yeah, it's really interesting. And Steven had a lot of interesting ideas about the Mustafar dual animatic. So I don't know where we should start.
I think we can kind of go through them. Like Charlotte said, the animatics aren't that interesting to talk about, but I do think there are certain components of the animatics, each of them that are interesting, that were ultimately cut from the film, that I feel like are just kind of at least worth touching on. The Utapau chase animatic was so long. It was really long.
Way too long. I was like, oh, this is still going on.
We're still here. But the part I did like about it, one is Obi-Wan kind of gets a kind of a pseudo Raiders of the Lost Ark moment where he's being dragged behind Grievous's bike thing, wheel thing.
Yeah.
Coming up against the walls of my Star Wars knowledge. His wheel thing.
Everyone knows what we're talking about. It's fine. You guys all know. You don't need the technical terms. It's the wheel thing.
You don't need the technical terms, and we also don't have them to give to you. So, but he's being dragged behind it, and is pulling himself up, very adjacent to Raiders of the Lost Ark, which I think would have been fun to include. But more than that, I think the ending duel between Obi-Wan and Grievous changes a lot, actually, to what we see in the final film. And there's a lot more somersaulting of Grievous and Obi-Wan on top of each other, which I think is pretty fun. But I also think that Grievous's death is way more violent in the animatic. Firstly, it looks like, and I'm sure this was just a placeholder, but it's literally a brain where Grievous's heart is. It's a brain. That's what it's shaped like. That's what it looks like.
Heart brain.
Heart brain. It's very big. And the way that Obi-Wan rips it out, throws it on the ground, and then shoots the heart brain multiple times, and then dumps Grievous's body off the cliff. It's a lot.
It's so much. There's also a pretty epic train crash sequence in this. And if you're wondering, if you haven't seen this, wow, there's a lot that's going on. You'd be correct. Then there's also a racing sequence as well that goes through the Utapau city. They'd have to render so much of the city. There was even talk in the making of book about, do we need to make like restaurants? Are they going to be going through the restaurants?
Big like sinkhole component that was much bigger.
Intense.
Yeah.
There's a lot there.
Anyway, it was too long. The heart brain was a lot. And ultimately, Obi-Wan saying so uncivilized was a way better ending than him kicking Grievous's dead body off the cliff while the heart brain is still beside him. So, right call here.
For sure. The next one is a Kashyyyk. Wait, did you have something to say?
Go ahead.
Okay. The next one is the extended version of the Kashyyyk attack and an extended alternate cut of what the Order 66 Jedi's death would look like. We got a lot of this, right? But the Kashyyyk attack is so long as well. The placeover voices are really funny in all of these. The Yoda voice is hilarious, and we see Order 66 happen to Ki-Adi-Mundi, Ayla Secura. We see Quinlan Vos, we see Barriss, we see Luminara, we see Yoda like violently shaking. It's a lot, guys.
This one is.
But what was really cool about this one is that we have Palpatine in the middle of the sequence looking evil at his desk.
Yeah, I think there's two shots that they're paralleled with Yoda, of like a close-up on Yoda's face, and then it will cut to Palpatine looking sinister. And the one part of this that I'm kind of curious if you think maybe should have stayed in, because I can't decide how I feel about it, or if it should have stayed in, is when Yoda says, "Something's wrong, stay alert." And I thought that was a good kind of foreboding. I think maybe if it had been cut differently, like not right when Order 66 happened or right when he's feeling the deaths of other Jedi across the galaxy. I don't know. It felt very ominous. And I kind of liked that maybe Yoda was feeling a shift in the galaxy before it actually started happening.
I think we see that with him holding his heart in the final cut of the movie.
I agree, but that's when it's already happening.
Yeah.
So I think you're right. I don't know. That was the part of this that I liked because, and then also seeing Palpatine in the middle of the scene as Yoda is realizing, I think, the scale of what's happening across the galaxy. I like because especially once we get Yoda and Palpatine battling later in the film in the Senate chamber, then this I think kind of connects the two of them here as well.
Yeah. I think it would have been
Yeah.
fine. I don't have any strong opinions either way, unfortunately.
All right, the next animatic is the Mustafar animatic, which this one was also very long. The faces that are put onto these animatics are quite terrifying. I'm not going to lie to you. And, there's a quote from Steven in here. Do you want to read it?
Yeah. So August 2003 at Skywalker Ranch, Ben Burtt and Dan Gregoire are on the phone with Steven Spielberg about the Mustafar animatic. So it's very clear that Steven was staring at the Mustafar animatic all day. And Steven asked Ben about the sequence of Anakin hurling lava at Obi-Wan. And Ben says that the idea is Anakin using the Force. Another shot of Obi-Wan making a wave of lava towards Anakin. It's very clear that this scene is even longer than what we saw in this animatic, right? But he says, Steven Spielberg says, I like all of this because it's biblical and mythological, but it feels slow to me. He says that the scene with the lava has the Moses effect. So the work continues. And then later, George Lucas says, our director came up with a good idea. He says, Obi-Wan and Anakin would end up on a large burning piece of masonry on a lava flow. Steven explains, they'd have to stop fighting and without speaking start hacking off pieces with their lightsabers to create a path in which to jump to shore. The concept here was that they'd have to sort of work together in order to continue to fight and also save themselves within the perils of the lava, which I think is interesting and sort of does come into play during the fight, right? Do you agree with that?
Yeah, I think so, yeah.
It's not super obvious, but I mean, they're going to many different places, right? When they're fighting, it starts off on the skiff and then it goes inside the Senate or the meeting rooms, and they're throwing everything around and slicing things up, going through the tunnels, going on the balcony, out over the outside on pipes.
Out over the outside. The lava river.
It's just there's a lava river, the like external things that they accidentally set off that are going to be taken off. So while they're trying to kill each other, they're also trying to save themselves. It's this push and pull, I think, of danger that's all around them. And to me, I'm like, this is just really emphasizing the hellish nature of Mustafar, and they're both in hell, and they're both trying to claw their way out of hell. Honestly, I think that's what's going on mythologically. I think that's what's going on symbolically. And Steven's idea here to really play into the fact that it's not just them fighting against each other, but it's also them trying to save each other, I think works.
Yeah, and another piece of it too is that they've talked about this in other places, but that the planet is also kind of being destroyed. This whole setup, this building is being destroyed through the process. And I think we really see a lot of that in this animatic with, I don't even know what you would call it, but like the huge piece of machinery that they're floating on for a lot longer, where they're like hanging on the cables and they're walking on the pipeline. Very similar to the cut animatic on The Invisible Hand too, where they're on a pipeline. So that also would have been an interesting parallel. What's interesting about the Lava River animatic is that we get these cuts where they tell us what scenes they're missing from the cut, and it's written in Comic Sans, which is a choice.
The abuse of the font Comic Sans in the production of Revenge of the Sith needs to be studied.
Reaches into Star Wars Revenge of the Sith at Skywalker Ranch at the highest level. In the most emotional, dramatic moment of the film, someone made a choice to use Comic Sans. And I would like to know who did
And
that.
it goes, Annie and Obi are fighting here. It's like, okay.
I mean, it calls
my
for
God.
Times New Roman at the very least. If you ask me. We
Exactly.
need Mustafar is in need of a serif font, you know?
100%. Comic Sans is not welcome in here. We're talking about the Moses level mythological effect, and we're putting Comic Sans here. Also, one other thing that's kind of funny about this, since we're just lingering on the funny stuff, is that Hayden's hair in the animatic changes. It goes from ponytail to non-ponytail, ponytail to non-ponytail. And I've taken this time often to just thank whoever decided to feather Hayden's hair, make him have the hair extensions, which, by the way, I didn't even know that was a wig / hair extensions until maybe 2022. It was kind of a world-shattering thing for me, if I'm being completely honest, but it's okay. I feel like
I think it was George because he wanted. I think I remember reading he wants the hair to more closely mimic the shape of the helmet.
Exactly, and it was George, and I think that some of the concept art of like his head shaved and having this like mohawk thing, George was like, this is too much. And then even in I think it's the foreword of the book, the making of book with Rick McCallum, he says, and my teenage daughters are just obsessed with young Darth Vader. And I'm like, yes, that is the effect that the hair had on him. So I'm really thankful that we don't have the long ponytail. The feathered helmet vibe is perfection.
The feathered helmet vibe.
What else are you going to say?
You're right. I don't know.
It was not represented in the animatic, though.
It was not in the animatic. His lightsaber color also changes throughout the animatic. He has
it was so frustrating.
Every color. He has blue, he has green, and he has red. And also in some of the concept art, Anakin has a green lightsaber. So it makes you wonder if there was a point where he lost his lightsaber and took it from one of the Jedi he killed. You know what I mean? As to why he would have a green one. Also,
but then that doesn't make sense given Obi-Wan grabbing the lightsaber at the end in the lava to eventually present to Luke. So it's sort of one of those. It's interesting because like I totally agree with you that maybe that was kicked around, but eventually they land on.
He's got to get the lightsaber. Yeah,
he has to keep his lightsaber because it'll be a moment when Obi-Wan takes it from the hillside.
Yeah, exactly. One of the things that was interesting. So I don't know if we really described what was happening very well with the Comic Sans of it all, but so you're watching the animatic and then it cuts to a black scene where there's text on the screen that is basically for production of, we need to put this specific sequence here, but it's not done yet, but this is where it's going to go. And it's just text. So one of them says, Obi and Annie leap from platform to platform, orphans of the sun sequence. All platforms are swept over the falls until only 2 are left. This I thought was really interesting because I never heard this reference of Orphans of the Storm. And I'm not sure if this is what it's supposed to be referencing, but Orphans of the Storm is a 1921 silent film about the French Revolution by D.W. Griffiths, who is the director of The Birth of a Nation, which they also reference his filmmaking in the making of book as well, which I was like, what is happening here? But you can watch Orphans of the Storm on Wikipedia. And yep. And I kind of skipped through it a bit. There is a duel between the two leads in it with fencing swords, picks. I don't remember what they're called. On a set of
eppies.
Yes, on a set of stairs. And that was really, I was like, is there something here that I'm supposed to be drawing on?
Yeah, I think it's exactly that, because even when they were there's a sequence of them climbing, right? And it's just basically them going up really quickly. It's just this motion of them going up the thing. And eventually, I guess when that piece would go over the lava flow, maybe it would create a staircase of sorts in which there would be a duel over a staircase.
Yeah, I will say in Orphans of the Storm, it's not very long at all. We're talking like 30 seconds tops, not at all Mustafar levels. So I thought this was interesting. I didn't really know anything about Orphans of the Storm. Something that is also interesting about the film, though, is that it used, I don't really know what the right terminology is, but it would basically different types of scenes had different color overlays for the whole scene. So it wasn't just black and white. There was blues and yellows and then like sepia tone and things like that. And those were used purposefully throughout the film, which was was really important for that film and part of what it's known for and things like that. And there is a quote somewhere in the making of book about George cautioning people to not use the color red until we get to Mustafar. So I also kind of wondered if there's something there as well to this Orphans of the Storm reference.
Yeah.
I could
That's what it is. That has to be it.
I feel like that too. So I wonder if there would have been something even more dramatic with the color red, perhaps. I don't know. I also might be barking up the wrong tree here because I don't know, this is a random reference in the middle of this animatic, but I feel like there is something with the Orphans of the Storm 1921 film that would have been included in here. So wanted to bring that up.
As temp clips or something. Yeah, for
Mhm,
sure.
yeah.
Yeah, I think that's true about the red. One of my favorite, this is such an aside, but one of my favorite pieces of concept art from Ian McCaig of Padmé in Revenge of the Sith is this like profile shot. She's in the outfit that she wears at the end when she's choked. And she has a piece of red in her hair and it's like a red ribbon. This doesn't
Mhm.
end up in the final. Do you know what I'm talking
Yep.
about? Where it says
The
the
bull.
red, the bowl. So it's red as to evoke bullfighting, and the idea that Ian McCaig had was that she's married to a monster, so she is provoking the bull by going to Mustafar. And so when she would wear that, she would be provoking the bull. So it's just interesting that you bring up the red there because that is something symbolically seen in one of her last scenes in the series, right?
Mhm.
Yeah, interesting.
Yeah, I think there's also the component too of like the red string of fate as
Yep.
well, that would be a
Yep.
good another component to if that had ended up in the film as well.
For sure. Okay. So then closing out on the Mustafar duel animatic, I think we just have it's maybe the best lightsaber fight in all of Star Wars. And I think that's subjective, but I think a lot of that has to be thanked to Steven Spielberg. Editing by the pool.
Thank you, poolside Steven.
Yes. Okay, so then the last animatic that we have is the Senate duel animatic. It is a longer scene of Yoda fighting Palpatine. Some cool things that come up in this. It is pretty similar to what we get into the final cut, but we have Yoda. One thing I find interesting is that in the final cut of the movie, Yoda is basically completely taken off guard by Palpatine using the Force lightning on him and gets like immediately thrown against the wall, right? In the animatic, Yoda is standing before Palpatine at his desk underneath the Senate floor, and he uses the Senate Red Guards as he like grabs them by the Force and uses them as shields against the lightning and like crashes them into each other, which I thought was kind of cool. There's lots of lightning. There's a lot of really funny Yoda running all over like a little bug. Another cool thing is that they release all those, those little droid drone cameras that are filming Palpatine when he's giving the attack on my life, let me scarred and deformed thing. There's these yellow camera droids. And in the animatic, Yoda and Palpatine, when fighting, release like 50 camera droids, and the camera droids are filming them and they destroy them one by one. It's really kind of cool. And another cool piece is that they tear down the ceiling of the Senate building, not just the pods but also the ceiling. So the whole system of democracy and symbol of democracy comes down, ceiling and all. So I thought that was cool. There's another Comic Sans cut that says "Cut away to Anakin and Padme," and it's in Comic Sans, and it's also like, let's not cut into Anakin and Padme on Mustafar with this scene. Like, no, that we're not doing that. That's the emotional heart of the movie. So no.
Yeah, this was very long too, and all of them. Yoda and Palpatine on the big screens, basically from the camera droids, felt a little too. I don't know. It felt a little silly
1984
to me.
Oh, okay.
I don't. we went different directions.
Yeah, we did.
I don't know why, but just seeing them projected so big, it didn't work for me.
It did not work for me either because I was thinking too much about it.
I appreciate
was
your
like,
connection, but to me, it felt like they were on a football field, kind of.
fully, and I'm sure that's why they cut it, and I agree with you. I was thinking a little too much about it. I was like, there's gonna be footage of them fighting then. Is Palpatine gonna use this as propaganda for being attacked?
Okay.
But then he'd have to reveal that he's, like, using a lightsaber, and I was like, this is too much.
He could edit it. Palpatine's definitely got AI.
For sure.
When you put it like that, I'm like, okay, that could have been cool.
Yeah, so that was the 1984 connection.
Right, yeah.
Of like, this could be used for propaganda.
Mm-hmm, yeah, which, we love to talk about. And the immediate turn against all of the Jedi, that would have been a good use for it. But at least how it existed in the animatic, it didn't look that good. But that is just an animatic, so that's not really a fair judgment call by any means. So I don't know. This has never been my favorite duel, I'll be honest, guys. So
I was just about to say, is now a point where you want to talk a little bit about that?
No.
You hated this.
No,
went from like the get-go.
I really did. And I think because the first time I watched Revenge of... Okay, here's my story. Okay, guys, with this scene between Palpatine and Yoda. Is obviously when I started watching Star Wars with Charlotte, I knew I existed in the universe in 2005 and the Revenge of the Sith hype. I already knew all the spoilers, right? I knew Luke and Leia were twins. I knew Vader was the dad, and I knew he turned to the dark side. Blah, blah, blah. Okay. I knew all that. So I didn't feel like I needed to preserve a lot of the films before we watched them. And so I was already deep into fan vids on YouTube.
Neck deep in fan vids.
I was ingesting them at an alarming rate, okay? And all of the fantastic edits that existed on YouTube in 2006 about Mustafar, about Padmé and Anakin, about Obi-Wan and you know what they did not include? Nothing about Palpatine and Yoda. So the first time I watched Revenge of the Sith, I was so ready to like fully see this battle and appreciate it in totality, you know what I mean? And then I felt like every 10 seconds we were cutting back to Palpatine and Yoda, and I was like, my fan vids did not prepare me for this. And I'm so irritated. And anyway, that feeling has literally never changed for me. And it could change in the future. If you listen to our anniversary episode, a big thing we talked about was like past opinions can change, and that's great. This is one that has not changed for me, and it could in the future. I'm open to that. But as of now in 2025, it has not. And so I didn't really pay attention to the animatic either.
So safe to say you don't need a longer Senate duel.
And that feels like such a silly story to share, but it's my truth.
And also, but like, isn't it funny that it was like cut away to Anakin and Padmé? Like that's the struggle here.
That was the struggle. I was like, no, don't cut away to Palpatine and Yoda.
Don't cut away to Palpatine and Yoda when we're fighting on Mustafar. It's the coolest part.
Anyway, that's my truth about the Palpatine and Yoda fight. Also, I really hate the Yoda nails as he's falling down. It's an image you can hear. I really hate that. I don't personally like seeing Yoda just in the jumpsuit.
I think it's a similar feeling to when you see Ahsoka without the headband.
It is.
I
don't love it.
Ahsoka's episode 5.
And I don't like Palpatine calling Yoda his green little friend.
Okay, so Caitlin just freaking hates this scene. Did you guys know that?
I'm just really airing out my grievances with it. Anyway, I'm sorry.
Don't apologize. It's so funny. Yeah. So we didn't need this long one, but interesting to watch on my end, not for Caitlin.
I will say that the collapsing of the Senate building, I really do like the larger thematic nature of that. I can appreciate that.
And I know you can appreciate like this fighting in the Senate pod, the fact that they're throwing the Senate pod. It's freaking cool.
It is.
Like that's neat.
Yeah.
Anyway, so that is it for the animatics. Do we have anything else to say?
I don't think so. Man, this was a trip. I think I think we did better than I thought we would.
Yeah. Oh, we have a bonus. We're not completely
right.
done
We do
yet.
have the bonus. I forgot because we kind of talked a little bit about it earlier. But yes,
Yeah.
go into the bonus.
Okay, the bonus is, we talked about it earlier, the bonus scene with Obi-Wan and Padme. We still have never seen it. It's in the novelization. Will it ever exist? The people in the Jedi Council forums in April 2005 talk about how cutting the scene is essentially Obi-Wan. It's what I said before, is that by cutting it, it makes the reveal of Anakin's the father, isn't he, way more dramatic. But you really do lose that, like, Anakin is jealous, like, vibe by cutting it. The point of me bringing it up now is I'd really like to see it. And this is my petition to our listeners, if you work at Lucasfilm, to release it. Because I think our fans, all fans, Revenge of the Sith fans, Natalie Portman fans, Ewan McGregor fans, we all want to see it. Curiously, it's one of the first things shot. I think it might have been the second, or yeah, I think the first thing Natalie Portman shot for Revenge of the Sith. So interesting. Also, here's the line that would be in it, something along this effect. So it'd be really freaking nice if we could see it. So here's the line. I'm not blind, Padme, though I have tried to be for Anakin's sake and for yours. Anakin has loved you since the day you met in that horrible junk shop on Tatooine. He never even tried to hide it, even though we do not speak of it. We pretend I don't know. I was happy to, because it made him happy. You made him happy when nothing else truly could.
It's good. It's juicy. It's angsty. We deserve it.
We deserve it. And we have all these shots. It's even included in some behind the scenes featurettes.
Mm-hmm.
We need it.
Would you pick to put this in, or the seeds of some of the seeds of the rebellion?
So this being in, I feel like I agree that it makes the Anakin's the father, isn't he? I'm so sorry line is pretty epic.
Mm-hmm.
Like, it is such a mic drop. And I do worry that would be lost by this being in it. But I want to see it so bad.
I know. I think we at least need to see it. You know what I mean?
Yeah. I can't make that decision right now. But if Seeds of Rebellion, that's a huge ask for that to be put in.
Are you saying we need to start small?
I'm saying we need to start small. The other thing about this is that the continuity is confusing, because she's wearing the green dress in the scene, and the green dress doesn't come into play later. And I mean, if Padme is not one to outfit repeat, so
Correct.
that doesn't really make sense. So in between that, when Anakin says, Obi-Wan's been here, hasn't he? And Padme says, yeah, he came by this morning. He's worried about you. So we have that scene in Revenge of the Sith that exists, but it's referencing what this scene is, this deleted scene. I think there could have been another one, but I don't think there isn't. So then it doesn't make sense that she'd be wearing the green outfit, which we don't see yet until later, which is the Padme's rumination scene, which is like the best scene. So
yeah, and her the way that she talks about Obi-Wan visiting her room feels too casual for what is actually present in this scene of Obi-Wan, talking about how Anakin's always loved her. Whereas when Anakin does say Obi-Wan's been here, she's like, yeah, he's worried about you. Me too. She sounds, I don't know, it sounds too casual for what the conversation looks like, at least as we know it here.
Yeah, for sure. I just want to see it. So, period.
I think this is the year.
I deserve this.
I think this is the year.
This is the year. If it's going to be any year, it could be this year. That's it, I think, for the deleted scenes. Really good ones from Revenge of the Sith.
Yeah, there are really good ones. We'll have to do this again, especially I'm thinking The Last Jedi would be a good one to do, because we have a number of those, and Rian Johnson does do introductions, kind of commentaries on all of them as well, if I'm remembering correctly. So that would be a good one for us to do too. And
Attack of the Clones would be good too.
Yeah, they all would. Let's be honest. We'll do them all eventually.
Yeah. Just took us 8 years to do this one.
Yeah, but now that we've done it,
we've established a rapport. We've established how to do it.
You and I have finally established a rapport. After all these years, it's been established. Well, I think that is going to wrap up our discussion about the Revenge of the Sith deleted scenes. Thank you guys so much for listening. We would love to know what your favorite deleted scenes are from Revenge of the Sith. If Comic Sans offends you in relation to the Mustafar duel, as it clearly does, Charlotte and I. And yeah, we have a couple of Revenge of the Sith episodes planned for this year, as it is the anniversary. So this is just the tip of the iceberg, and we're really excited to be diving back in to this film in particular, because you know what? It's so good. It's really good. And we are excited to celebrate the anniversary, especially coming up for Celebration in Japan later this year, also in April. So if you want to talk to us all about deleted scenes, your favorites and otherwise, you can find us on Twitter/X at SkyTalkersPod, or our personal handles. Charlotte's is at Clarity and mine is at Caitlin Plesher. We also have our website, skytalkers.com, our Instagram, our TikTok, Facebook, and email, which is hello@skytalkers.com. Those are all great places to reach us. And if you have a couple seconds and would like to leave us a review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, we would so appreciate it, as it helps other people find our show. And if you're interested in other ways to support us and how to get involved in our Discord community, you can head on over to our Patreon and check out our different reward tiers there.
I want to say a huge thank you to these patrons: Joanna, Aaron, Alex, Angie, B, Brad, Brendan, Carrie, Kathy, Charlotte, Chris, Sindel, Daniel, Danny, David, Dean, Derek, Draconius Rex, Dylan, Emma, Eric, Eugene, Fernanda, Fifi, Froppy, Hannah, Jake, James, and Jason. Thank you so much for supporting us.
Yes, thank you guys so much. And until next time, may the Force be with you.
May the Force be with you.
This has been a 58 Ember production. For more shows, please visit the 58 Ember channel, 58ember.com, or find us at 58 Ember Media on socials.